The United States and Israel are bombing Iran. And in Armenia, we've learned something about geography. You don't have to be part of a war to feel its consequences. I don't know how you're feeling in the United States, Nerses, but here in Armenia, it's pretty tense.
I gotta tell you, it's not like things are all nice and rosy here in the United States from that perspective. It's a very interesting dilemma. The war clearly, when you look at all the polling, is not popular in the United States, and now with oil prices going on and fears of the economic fallout, it's definitely becoming a lot more complicated. But I think most definitely, as you noted, it's one thing to be concerned about economics of things and another to have a war in your backyard and actually have a physical security threat to your entire country and your region as well. So in that context, as we say, right, in Armenia, we feel it in our skin. Away from Armenia, you kind of only sense it.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about that today. I was looking at some people's comments and, what Armenia should do or shouldn't do. And I was wondering, it's easy to say those things when you're not here and when you're not feeling it. I mean, obviously, we're not hearing bombs. The southern part of Armenia, there were reports that in the southern town of Gapan, they could actually hear the bombing taking place in northern Iran. So I'm
Right.
sure that rattled the population quite vigorously. Look, we don't need to tell, I think the whole world knows what's going on. But just recently, Iran was able to elect a new leader, which is the son of the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei that was killed the first day of the airstrikes. And I've been trying to follow, the Iranian response, and they're like us. They have a very big diaspora who's very vocal, and then there's millions of them living in Iran themselves. What have you been hearing about the reactions of this new leader? And I'm talking a little too quickly, but there's a lot to unpack. Um, it seems every time they would appoint a new leader, they would be killed. So it's kind of interesting to see that it was his son.
Yeah, so U.S. Israel, they're going with what's known as the decapitation policy, right? Well, they keep trying to take out the leadership of Iran or the newly elected leadership. We saw this from the 12-day war last June. Israel used the same mechanism in this current operations. That is kind of an extension of that approach. The assumption is that decapitation would lead to loss of control and command, therefore create chaos in the Iranian security apparatus, and the probability of the regime not being able to have the resiliency that one would think would be heightened, and thus could lead to some level of fragmentation. So far, we're not seeing that. United States has conceded that the decapitation policy, while successful operationally, in the broader picture of like sort of what they're trying to do politically, it's not achieving those objectives. But that's just one component of it. Right, so there's been like a bit of a back and forth, right? As you know, with respect to sort of like the diaspora thinking, big part of the Iranian diaspora in the West is or people who left Iran prior to the revolution or right after the revolution. So most hate, the Shia Islamic political system, and so they have been, generally speaking, very supportive of this. And then, you have the Shah's son who's trying to position himself as the next leader, and nobody's taking him seriously. So he's on social media kind of crying about it. You have those dynamics as well. But overall, the Iranian diaspora is very supportive of the United States using force to basically have regime change for understandable reasons from their perspective. Uh, and so, what you're seeing is Iranian society not rising up as it was assumed, and that's primarily due to the fact that only about a month and a half ago, nearly 30,000 Iranians were massacred with the attempted social uprising. And so they have fatigue and immense amount of fear to domestically rise up. Also, we can't deny the fact that uh, Iran's internal security apparatus is extremely strong. right? So Iran right now is a weak country because it cannot defend itself against external attackers. That's how we qualify a weak country, right? But internally, it is still a strong state because its security apparatus is able to sustain and control the country. So it's a very, very complicated dynamic. So what the Iranian diaspora wants and what's happening on the ground are two very different things. U.S. policy, Israeli policy is completely something else we could discuss. U.S. policy isn't driven by the Iranian diaspora in the U.S., right? So I have to kind of make that really, really clear. But the perceptivity, the social media content, as you've seen, right? This is very popular among the diasporan Iranians. Domestically, as I noted, it's so much more complicated because you have large sectors of Iranian society that do want a more open, free society. But then you have a really large chunk that is part of the regime, right? The institutions, the civil servants, the extended families, the religiously devout who actually believe in the system. So Iran is an extremely complicated society, and so to assume that few diasporan voices and couple of operations, couple of decapitation moves are going to change the dynamic really quick. It's not. So we right now we still don't know, even in the domain of all the advanced modeling that we do and understanding outcomes, we still don't know how this is going to play out.
Yeah, I think in some circles, in the rush to pass judgment or to make or to pass some kind of analysis, they flatten things out. And Iran, like you said, is so complex and so nuanced, and there's so many layers there. It's not that easy to, you can bomb it away, but like you said, the entrenched elite in that country are certainly not going to let things slip away from their fingers, as it were.
Right. I
And
mean, their entire security system is designed to preserve the revolution,
sure.
right? And so Iran's army is not the most powerful actor. It's the what we call the Praetorian Guard, the Revolutionary Guard that dominates things, right?
Mhm.
And then they have the morality police, the Basij militias, who are also very powerful. So Iran's domestic security dynamic is a lot more unique than what we know in a lot of the West countries or what we're exposed to. And so this is one of the important things to consider.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was surprising for a lot of us was how swiftly Iran. It was expected that they would hit Tel Aviv or Israel, but how they then started, sending in drones and ballistic missiles to the Gulf countries, to many, almost all the countries in the Middle East. And it was, for me, it was like a little bit of dissonance because I'm thinking, if you had any natural allies, if you had any natural allies, you're certainly bombing them right now. That's not going to help your cause. What was the thinking?
The Yeah, no, the Gulf, the Gulf Council, the GCC, which basically makes up of the Gulf states from Saudi Arabia to Bahrain, Oman, Kuwait, Qatar, the Emirates, etc. They are not natural allies of Israel. I'm sorry, of Iran, but they have become concealed allies of Israel. This is something very important that needs to be discussed. Israel has extensive operations in Qatar, in the
So does the United
Emirates.
States, though. They have
Exactly,
base.
because well, just not to get too academic here, right? But the GCC, right, the Gulf Council, Cooperation Council, which includes these countries, was formed in 1981. It was precisely formed to both preserve petro autocracies in the region, right? Because there was fear of the socialist spread during the Cold War and the Shia spread after the Iranian Revolution, all that stuff. So the GCC is a security umbrella created by the United States that it protects these countries because of their massive oil production capacity. Okay, so they are cannot in any way be a natural ally of Iran, and Iran's strategic approach is that I don't have the ability to hit the United States. Iran's ability to hit Israel is quite limited. Sometimes the missiles go through, but overarchingly, they're not going to able to institute any level of damage that could deter Israel, right? So what they can do is destabilize the broader region, destabilize the oil markets, harm the global economy so that enough international pressure, even domestic pressure due to expensive oil and inflation would convince the United States to stop. So that is the Iranian policy. And this should have surprised anybody, because if anybody studied Iran's security doctrine, they've always been they've had their concept was known as forward defense. Okay, we've studied this for a long time. I mean, it's nothing out of the blue, and they operate through proxies. Okay, so whether it's proxy operations, right? We've seen with Syria and Hezbollah and all that stuff, or whether it's through proxy attacks, right, on specific countries to convince the more powerful actors that this is starting to get out of control. Now, we don't know if that's going to work. Okay, so the Gulf Cooperation Council countries are being basically carrying the brunt of the economic attacks. Qatar has stopped basically its natural gas production. Bahrain's freaking out. Emirates are losing their sort of reputation as being the hub of safe tourism and all that stuff, right? So the most affluent, wealthiest region in the Middle East is right now freaking out. And so, from that perspective, Iran's model is working to harm the GCC. But I don't think the United States is going to change policy at this point, and Israel's definitely not changing policy at this point, just because the GCC is being slapped around by Iran. But to the point, the consequences are going to be a lot more nuanced, because down the line, these GCC countries are actually, they're extremely wealthy. They're armed to the teeth by the United States, right? They buy billions and billions in U.S. weaponry. And what's going to happen is, let's say whenever this conflict stops, okay, in whatever iteration, you already have produced an enemy, right, across the Strait of Hormuz. And these guys are basically going to be antagonistic towards Iran, because from their perspective, Iran is hitting them for no reason. Of course, Iran's rationale is different.
Yeah, not all of us study Iran security policies, obviously. But what I was saying when I said natural allies is I meant that he's creating more enemies than it needs at the moment, right?
But I think Iran always considered the Gulf Council, Cooperation Council, as enemies. It's an open secret, but now it's just kind of worse. And listen, Iran would love to sort of have this back to the Sunni Shia Cold War, because that is its bread and butter in maintaining regional influence. So, it's a question of asymmetrical warfare, right? And it's a question of what the outcome is going to be. But, just a very, very quick point, since we're discussing this, and hopefully we're going to tie this to Armenia. Iran's been preparing for this conflict for the last some 45, 50 years. It clearly showed that their security system wasn't up to par, and that what we have with Iran right now is kind of similar what you had with Saddam in the early 90s, that they have no control over their airspace. So their presumed enemies could just bomb them at will, or bomb them whenever they want. That puts the Iranian regime, like I said, strong domestically, but externally basically incapable of defending their country.
Indeed. And just, you mentioned the oil prices surged on Monday, went up to $119 a barrel, which is numbers that haven't been seen for quite a while. And this is absolutely, it's going to put a strain
Yeah,
on the
Putin
global
and Putin and
economy. And
Olive
that's
are partying right now.
yeah.
This is going to be temporary, but
Yeah.
they need the
Speaking of
money, right? They need the
Speaking of
money.
Putin and Aliyev, the beginning days of the attack, which is ongoing, there were people saying, well, Iran hasn't attacked Turkey yet, or but then surprisingly or not surprisingly, there were reports of a drone attack in Nakhichevan, which is the exclave, Azerbaijan's exclave airport, and a nearby school. Few people were injured. Aliyev came out very strong and even
Very
made
Aliyevi, yeah.
yeah, and even made some comments about Azerbaijan being the home of Iranian Azerbaijanis. But it seems that they are trying now to dial down that the escalatory rhetoric. And Pezeshkian, got in touch with him and said, this wasn't from Iran. It could be a false flag operation. Talk to me about. I mean, I think Azerbaijan is in a more difficult position than we are,
Absolutely.
for
Absolutely.
sure.
So listen, with Armenia, we did something but very, very thing clever. And I know, as you noted, there's a lot of this stuff on social media. What is Armenia doing? And why isn't Armenia saying this or Armenia saying that? That's not how this works, okay? And as you know, from last June, when after the 12th Day War, we started developing Armenia's policy because we knew and anticipated that it was a matter of time that the war down south was going to be reinitiated. Okay, so in Armenia, we developed a policy of strategic ambiguity, that is going to be our policy towards conflict down south. Because if you don't have strategic ambiguity, even if you insinuate a certain specific side you're leaning towards, you put yourself in a lose lose situation. In the domain of gain, Armenia has nothing to gain if it's not ambiguous, right? It's extremely dangerous for us. And this is why the way we've navigated has so far made Armenia, relatively speaking, as of we speak, the safest actor, right, coming out of this entire regional conglomeration. And so with respect to Azerbaijan, right? Exactly. You know, Azerbaijan fancied itself, the strongest military actor in the South Caucasus, and all they're running around with his iron fist and blah blah blah, right? And then the Nakhichevan drone attacks happen, all right? Now, two things to mention, okay? When these attacks were happening, even when something was directed at the Incirlik air base towards Turkey, and then something went towards Cyprus, and the one in Nakhichevan, we have to be very honest in how these things happen. Uh, we still don't have enough knowledge of how the IRGC is operating because there is still some confusion. And so you do have units, for example, that are carrying out operation that might not be receiving orders directly from up top. Okay, because the control and command structure is being constantly disrupted, especially after the first couple of days, right? So it's possible that these attacks, right, these drones that were sent on Azerbaijan, on Cyprus, on Incirlik, were not ordered from up top. But that doesn't change the dynamic, okay? What's interesting is Aliyev, right, who keeps banging his chest in Azerbaijan that, he's God's gift to this impoverished, suppressed people, and that no one could mess with the glory of the Aliyev family and all that stuff, just got hit, right, by an external actor. And so for him, that was a direct attack to his domestic image as sort of this infallible strongman who's protecting Azerbaijan and conquering territories. And right after the drone attack, right on Nakhichevan's airport, everybody saw what Ali was talking about, right? Banging, nobody could mess with us. He threw out the iron fist again, so on and so forth. And today, he opened the roads with Iran, right? And basically it's all lovey-dovey with the Iranian regime. Well, what happened to the Iron Fist, bro? You were out there throwing these concepts around, all right? What we see is a typical autocratic bully that has the capacity to engage this kind of behavior against an asymmetrically weaker country. But when it comes to a stronger state, he's going to engage in a performative domestic, outbursts. But in reality, there is no iron fist. Okay, right? He's just sitting there, basically trying to be the tough guy, so that his populace would be like, our great glorious leader. And Iran kind of, made it very clear: you keep acting up, there's going to be consequences. And Aliyev did not respond to any of that commentary rhetoric coming out of the Iranian army, which kind of suggests that he realized he can't be dragged into this. And so Aliyev is finding himself in a lot more difficult position where everybody thought he would be situated in the best possible position. So these are the moving dynamics that are kind of shifting things. And Armenia is not navigating this in a way that doesn't throw us in any traps because we don't have the luxury of being caught in any of the regional traps.
Sure. Before we switch to Armenia a little bit more comprehensively, just one more thing, because again, I've been, like most people, following the news and reading different commentaries and such, not Armenian. I mean, that's complicated enough if you read
Yeah.
Armenian commentary, but they're saying some Iranian officials have suspected that Israel had used Azerbaijani territory during the 12-day war, that some of the artillery that's coming is coming from Azerbaijan. Is there any credence to that?
Uh, you know,
Your guess
uh,
is as good as mine.
yeah, there's speculation and there's some sort of level of deep pattern analysis. No, missiles are not coming out of Azerbaijan. Okay, drones are not coming out of Azerbaijan. But does Israel have base of operations in Azerbaijan for covert operations? Of course they do. Okay, all this support that they've giving Azerbaijan isn't for, as we say in Armenian, Aliyev's pretty eyes. Right? Clearly, they have a strategic reason where Azerbaijan serves as a base of covert operations. In the past, a lot of nuclear scientists have been assassinated from operations carried out through the Azerbaijani border into Iran. So covert Mossad operations, things of that sort, definitely. But that's kind of part of the territory, right? Because Iran's tried to do that to Israel, to Hezbollah, through Syria. That's kind of part of the game. Okay, but in the domain of warfare, right? If in fact that was the case, Azerbaijan would have been bombarded right now because Iran would immediately jump on that. Because it's one thing, right? For example, the Gulf states have military bases. Okay, and for Iranians to hit those military bases, it's another for you to be a base of operations right next door when there's a land border. So to answer your question, we don't dabble in the domain of speculation, but past empirical findings, clear traceable evidence of covert operations, but nothing to the level of rocket attacks, missile or drone attacks out of Azerbaijan. At least not now. I mean, we'd be lucky if that was the case, because then Iran would be retaliating. Okay,
Okay, well, no,
but then,
I
that's
think we're
something
good.
else.
I think we're good with conflicts,
Yeah.
Nerses.
Well, we don't want to
Um,
get involved. We just
but coming back to Armenia, you had written about strategic ambiguity after the 12-day war in your security reports on EVN report, and I think any normal, logical, rational person would understand that that is the only possibility that Armenia has. Armenia is in an impossible situation, signing strategic partnerships with the United States, the TRIP project, the MOUs, and then your southern neighbor, which is a main artery for you, a lifeline. So you can't be taking sides on this matter rather. But and I ask half the time, when I ask you these questions, I know the answer, but I ask it only because it is part of the public debate, and I want to put things into perspective. Yeah. Uh, if TRIP had been built, or if it was the infrastructure project was halfway built, would that be a target? Would that be seen as an American asset on behalf of Iran? Yeah. And then so let's start with that one.
that's a great question. So because TRIP is a joint Armenia project and it is under Armenian law and Armenian jurisdiction, Iran takes that into consideration. Also, we need to note that the U.S. has a lot of assets in the region. What Iran is doing is they're prioritizing the assets that they are hitting, because they just can't be hitting any asset, because there's also a cost benefit analysis to them. So I don't imagine, as you noted initially, Iran attacking its only friendly actor in the region, right? Cutting off its access north, ruining one of the closest relations it's had since 1991, because they're pissed off at the United States and so they want to hit a road. So in that context, even if TRIP was built, the probability of Iran acting against it is exponentially low. I'm not saying it's not possible, right? But it's exponentially low, because it would have completely ruined relations with Armenia, and Iran has no reason to ruin relations with Armenia. Second, the TRIP project, in essence, compared to the oil refineries in the Gulf states or the military bases, is nothing of substantive in relative terms with respect to Iran being concerned about it, right? So if the logic is Iran would have targeted TRIP to punish the United States, you're not punishing the United States at all with that act. But what you're doing is you're ruining your relationship with one of your closest partners in the region. So, Iran is a rational actor. This logic that they're going to be engaging in emotional attacks and all that stuff, that's not how these things work. Okay. So I don't take that conversation seriously. Okay. And I don't take the logic that Armenia will not be able to navigate strategic ambiguity, therefore, sooner or later has to pick sides. Okay, so that thinking really is, as you know, a very undersurface, unsophisticated thinking. But it's a very good question for us to have a conversation about. Okay, also, Armenia has done an excellent job of being transparent and consistently communicating with Iran about TRIP. Now, if TRIP had a specific security component like American boots on the ground, we'll be having a different conversation right now, right? It'd be dishonest of me to say, oh, it's out of the question they would have attacked TRIP if even if US had troops on the ground. No, that probability would have increased because for the Iranians, even killing one or two American soldiers is high thing, political dividends for them. Okay, so in that context, if the Iranians are going to hit anything in Armenia, okay, I'm just saying, they wouldn't be hitting Trip. They'd probably try to hit the U.S. embassy. Very much what they're doing in Saudi Arabia and so on and so forth. So this, again, I don't want to kind of go into the whole anti-Russia rant here, but these are sort of the pro-Russia groups in Armenia that are trying to create this fear and panic that Trip poses a security threat to Armenia because if it is built, Iran will hit it, and then boom, our relations are all screwed up. What are we in kindergarten? I mean, let's be serious about these conversations.
Well, look, I mean, this is their job. This is what they
I
are
don't
here.
call it a
This is their
job, but yeah,
no, their objective is to
right.
create is to play on the natural fears that people will have. Because look, if you look at the map of the region, and it's being shared widely, it's all red, right? All the countries that have come under, and then there's little Armenia, right smack in the middle of all of it. Uh, to the north, we have the Russian-Ukraine war going on. To the south, we have Iran being bombed, and all the other countries in the region. So naturally, people are very, very concerned, and these groups are going to be, playing on those concerns. I think our job is to let everybody know that, let's calm down for a second and let's look at this logically and rationally. And this is why we're having this conversation, because again, as I said, just for context, I'm asking these questions not because I give credence to them. It's only because these things are being discussed.
Absolutely,
So,
absolutely.
could
Yeah.
the United States, or does the United States need Armenia at this point to do anything in
No, of
this
course not.
operation
Well,
that
what's
is
it going to need from Armenia?
massive?
Armenia. What could Armenia offer? Honestly, the only thing that would be interesting to the United States, as far as need, would be intelligence. But Armenia being Armenia, being under Russia's orbit that you were, you really never developed a foreign intelligence capacity, did you? Right? So we had the NSS, right? That was basically designed to prop up the administrations of Kochar and Sarkeesian, right? And no foreign intelligence capacity. And then, recently we put together the Foreign Intelligence Service, which is a new information gathering organization that gauges risk propensity on Armenia. So Armenia does not have the capacity to collect evidence or anything like that. And that is the main thing that would be of interest to the United States. And so if they could ask us of anything, right? If they could ask us of anything, it would be that. But considering the fact that we don't have it and they know we don't have it, right? There's not much else that can ask of us. So in that context, right, the United States understands Armenia here is the only true natural neutral actor that does not pose a threat to either side, and therefore Armenia basically maintaining its ambiguity is good for everyone. So this is also something we need to understand. Armenia's ambiguity is good for Tehran because they're like, you know what? We don't have to worry about our neighbor north doing something that's harmful for us. And it's also good for the United States because the United States is going to be like, we don't have to worry about our strategic partner, right, creating problems or issues and then coming to us like Georgia did, for example, in the past, and saying, "Hey, can you please come to our aid?" Okay, or even I don't even think the United States is very happy with Azerbaijan right now, right? Because what Olive is going to do is he's going to turn around after this conflict is over and it's going to be like, hey there, Washington, I got hit because of you. So can you please give me something? So United States appreciates Armenia's ambiguity and they're not going to try to disrupt that by asking of Armenia of things that they know Armenia simply does not have.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Look, I think that again, laying low, saying the right things at the right time is the perfect strategy. But we've talked about this and we will talk about it forever, I think, unless we see some change. Strategic communication, right? They just didn't know how to communicate this. And again, you know, opposition, strange fringe groups start attacking the government for doing nothing and, going on the campaign trail while their southern neighbor was being bombed. So again, this is another issue that we don't realize the importance of the information space.
Right. No, no, there's nothing to disagree on. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, strategic communication is important. It's just, I think what we've learned, it's very interesting that you brought it up, is that the sort of, what do we would call it? Fringe groups, anti-democratic forces, whatever we want to call them, okay? uh, they really suck at what they do. Okay, and the reason for that is they
If they
go
suck
on
at
these
what they
like,
do, why are we talking about it then?
well,
Obviously, they don't
let me
suck that
explain.
bad.
Exactly, we're talking about it because they suck at what they do, right?
Okay, I
Uh,
agree.
they kind of blow up initially, right? Issues, and then take it to such an extreme that in matter of days or weeks,
Yeah, they
their
shoot
stuff
themselves in the foot.
becomes naturally discredited, and the citizens are like, okay, actually, maybe this government was right to be ambiguous because everybody's being attacked. We're not. Okay, and that everybody's concerned. We actually are not, right? And so exaggeration, right, always breeds a capacity for natural development things to debunk that exaggeration. That's what I mean when I say they suck at what they do. They're not very clever about it. At the same time, right, as you noted, once they start exaggerating things, the government's ability to more concretely mitigate during that period those misinformation stuff is very, very limited, as you correctly note. So there is definitely a strategic communication issue. But what I'm saying is, if those forces didn't suck as much as they do, the lack of strategic communication for this government would have been an even bigger problem, right? Much bigger problem.
Yeah, indeed. Um, Before we move on, I know you're not an economist, but one of the concerns that I've been hearing, and which is a serious concern, is the economic impact that this could have on Armenia. I'm sure people are very wary of traveling to the region. Many of our compatriots, I mean, not only ours, hundreds of thousands of people were stuck in airports, couldn't get flights because of cancellations. We don't know how long this is going to be prolonged. The airspace over Iran and Iraq is basically closed. So, the South Caucasus has become sort of like this transit corridor. Having said that, tourism is a very important part of Armenia's economy. And as we're heading into spring and summer, if this is a protracted conflict, how will this bode on elections?
That's a great question. So the economic thing fallout is something that we're really, really concerned about. Now, usually, a 4 or 5 week conflict generally does not produce macroeconomic change. But few things that we kind of noted at, and this is also a concern for Armenia, high oil prices globally are going to create an inflation. And in Armenia, right, this is a concern because it's still one of the more expensive countries in the Eurasian continent. Sure, we have immense economic growth, the fastest growing economy in the region, but things are also expensive, and so inflation is always politically a very, very serious problem. So inflation is never good for the incumbent government. So in that context, to answer your question, that could be one concern. Second, as you know, the tourism makes up about Armenia's 16-17% of its economy. So it's a very, very healthy chunk. Now, the initial shock would kind of, die out of the conflict. And after the third, fourth week, everybody's like, oh, okay, they're still bombing, so on and so forth. There's no threat to Armenia. All flights from Europe are still there. So tourism will rebound. But right now, we are seeing a lot of cancellations, especially from the diaspora, which is fascinating. Like we love Armenia so much, but not enough to kind of go there when things are a little scary. Come on, who cancels things like that? Armenia is not in the theater of war. Okay, so in that context, but definitely right, sort of these regional destabilization processes do have a ripple effect, and so tourism is going to be taking a temporary hit. I can't say again, economists who do modeling will be be able to tell better than me what the actual impact would be. But in the immediate term, is not going to be as robust. Also, the elections are on June 7th, so generally, economic issues tend to lag by quite a bit. So even if this conflict produces a much more severe economic fallout regionally and globally than anticipated, that would not be felt until at least August or September, if that. And so it would be post elections. So those kind of dynamics to look at. Also, a bigger concern for me is Armenia's logistical access down south, right? The ports of Iran are used for trade from India, from other parts of the world, and then, through trucks and so on and so forth, right? These are transported up north and into Armenia. What's going to happen with these routes? What's going to happen with us? Our trucks going down, selling stuff, taking things to Iran, and Iranian products coming to Armenia, so on and so forth. So trade, commerce, and transportation, right, do tend to severely struggle and have fallouts during this period. So this is also another important concern. And so, we talk about, Armenia's access to South being an important artery of our unblocking process, because we're blockaded on both sides. Well, there might not be, de jure legal blocking of Armenia, but if this conflict, for example, spreads into domestic fragmentation, civil war, or things of that sort, then you can't have access south. So you're going to end up have some form of a de jure, some sort of a de facto blockade that's also potentially very, very dangerous for us. So, nobody's taking this lightly, obviously, and the economic concerns are quite severe. But the whole thinking is that this is not sustainable more than 4 or 5 weeks, especially in the domestic front in the United States. And even if after 4 and 5 weeks there is no ceasefire, the magnitude of bombings and attacks would not be as what you have right now. So there would not be a continuous attack or harm to the functionality of at least economic relations and trade. Also, the United States and Israel are not carpet bombing Iran. That's very important to mention, meaning we're not having mass displacement of civilians. We're not having mass refugee inflows. Usually economies shut down when you have mass displacement. So we're not there yet. I'm not saying that's not a possibility, right? So if things continue as they are right now, where they keep hitting strategic sites, okay, hoping for a domestic uprising, unless a domestic uprising takes place, unless you have mass displacement or movement of peoples, I think the economic situation is going to be everybody's going to be able to control, mitigate for it, at least from the severe fallout.
Sure, I heard from some people who were in Tehran when the bombing started, and people are hunkering down at the moment. They're not moving. They're just waiting to see how things are going to play out. There, nobody's out in the streets protesting or, any kind of massive movement. What we saw, months earlier. So it's fascinating dynamic, and you're right. I mean, it really depends how things play out in Iran. If there is a civil war, all of a sudden everything changes for the
I'll
region
be
and for
honest. Yeah,
us.
if there's a civil war, we're screwed.
Yeah.
Straight up. There's no two ways about it, right? Because again, not to get too academic, in the domain of security studies, civil wars are the most difficult things to control. It's impossible to control,
Yeah.
and so between factionalism and intergroup fighting, things do get out of
Non-state
control.
actors. I mean,
And non-state actors don't care about borders. So you have
yeah,
cross-border
exactly.
raids. They try to establish bases to carry out operations. So that would be the most severe nightmare. And of course, with civil wars, economies collapse.
Hmm.
So Iran's economy, potentially due to civil war collapsing, would be a complete catastrophe for Armenia. So absolutely, that is a nightmare, worst case scenario for us. Nobody's blind to these things.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's those are very, very legitimate points.
One more thing. Again, these groups about the fragility of Sunik and the possibility that Aliyev will take advantage of the chaos in the region and try to take over Sunik.
Yeah, again, the typical, fear mongers. We see them in the United States. Anka has been running around talking about this. The ARF offshoots are trying to instill this fear. Sunik is at risk. Again, it's the same logic. Okay. But Aliyev cannot do what Aliyev wants to do and what Aliyev was able to do prior to the Washington Accords. So it's funny, all of those people who attacked the Washington Accords, the reason why the things they quote unquote fear are not happening is precisely because of the Washington Accords. Funny how that worked out. So, in that context, Aliyev's capacity to utilize force, specifically the opportunity that this conflict presents, right, for him, is a testament to the fact that the security architecture of the South Caucasus has changed. Okay, that if Aliyev does attempt any moves on Sunik, he would be rupturing and ruining his relationship with the United States, something that is worked on very, very aggressively, right, for the last 8, 9 months. And so, in that context, if we did not have the Washington 8 Accords, if we did not have the strategic partnership that Armenia developed with the United States, okay, if we did not have the sort of the diminishing of Russia in the region as an actor and the inclusion of the United States as the new hegemon, if all of these things didn't happen that have served as guardrails against Aliyev's capacity for aggression, not completely removed it, but decreased it, then we would be having serious fears right now. But clearly, you're not seeing any accumulation of forces on the border, right? Aliyev is more concerned about the Iranian border than doing anything on the Armenian border. So all of these are very, very clear indicators that those who are trying to basically instill fear in Armenian society are those same people who were opposed to the Washington Accords and the new security architecture that it afforded us. So there's kind of this incoherent paradox in their argument. Listen, of course we can't trust Aliyev, right? So the concern about him being an intrinsic sort of a belligerent actor is a given. Okay. But at the same time, his belligerence has been constrained by virtue of everything that we've done, right, in the last year, year and a half, and especially since the Washington Accords, to constrain that capacity for belligerence. And this is why Aliyev cannot do what we all know he would have loved to do if he had the ability to.
Right. How the world and our own small world has changed, hasn't it, since last year?
Most definitely. The entire system of the region has
Yeah.
shifted.
Before I let you go, Nurses, we did a podcast already about this topic, but I do want to talk to you again today. We recently published the Armenian election study, which is a voter behavior poll on EVN report. Dr. Rafael Oganesian and yourself designed the methodology, the questions. We had a rough go in the beginning, getting the
Polling is
questions.
always rough.
Polling is very rough. I didn't realize how rough a job it is. I'll be honest with you. I mean, it was just like, it was a pretty interesting experience. But we also got some very interesting results from that poll, and we're going to be doing three more, uh, leading right up to the election. So the next one should be at the end of this month, hopefully. Our first poll showed, and I wasn't surprised by this, that people felt that they were more secure now than they were a year ago. The attitudes toward trip were pretty robust. I was expecting a little bit more, but I think there's an explanation for that. Again, we come to strategic communication and not being
Correct.
able uh, to, to explain to the people exactly what trip is and what it can mean for Armenia's security, economy, and stability. And then how does all of this bode in your estimation? And also, let's just say civil contract is leading in the polls ahead of um, all of the other opposition parties. Interestingly or not interestingly, Samuel Karapetyan's party is in second place, well ahead of Armenia Alliance in our poll. Armenia Alliance isn't even passing the threshold to get into parliament.
Right.
So whatever happens in Iran, how is this all going to affect us here in our elections or the election period?
That's a really good question. So if our listeners haven't seen the polls, most have. It's been sort of a big subject of conversation. Uh, we produced content that's never been produced before, right? Because we were able to basically figure out using sort of sophisticated methodological techniques on how the undecideds lean, and that's been the secret. And so that allowed us to see several important things. But yeah, one of the things, as you noted, is that Armenian society said 50%, majority said Armenia is a lot more secure now than it was from a year ago. And of course, that's going to be correlated with TRIP to some extent and its relative popularity because most equate Armenia's enhanced security environment to the Washington Accords and the United States becoming a deeper partner with Armenia. So Armenian society understands that. But there are a few interesting things that the fallout from the war, right, if things go a certain way, can possibly affect these polling outcomes that we're seeing. For example, let us assume the conflict that continues, sustains itself, right? And let us assume hypothetically if few missiles go astray and land in Armenia, or the Shahid drones aren't always the most accurate and they could fall into Armenian civilian centers by accident, right? And so what would happen if this war continues and Armenian society basically says, we no longer feel as secure as we thought we would because of developments in the region. That doesn't mean they're going to blame the government, but if society feels a little insecure, right, they're subconsciously or indirectly going to blame the government. So if the broader regional destabilization process leaks into Armenia and creates a sense of insecurity for its citizens, these polling results could be very different in our second or third poll. Okay. Similarly, popularity towards TRIP, right? If, for example, we don't see sufficient movement on the building development of TRIP because of the war down south, right? Citizens will be like, well, was this just another big conversation and a lot of show and no substantive movement on the ground? And so, I'm not for it. I'm not against it. It's just whatever to me. Okay, right. So it can potentially, in our results, it can kind of go that direction until there are concrete steps. So these are things that we're kind of looking at in our polling when we trace these developments. Okay, on economics, right? Our polls show that Armenian society is very positive, relatively speaking, to prospective economic developments a year from now. A healthy chunk of Armenian society responded saying that we anticipate positive economic growth down the future. As we discussed, right, if the outcome of this war is such where it creates problems for Armenia's economic growth and that perspective changes, right, citizens might go from being hopeful in poll results to actually being very skeptical and I think concerned, and that also can change results. And why does all of this matter? Because if, for example, civil contract right now is polling about directly, purely without counting for undecideds at 26% in our polls, way ahead than whatever oppositions are in second place. And if they're polling at about 41% with the independents leaning towards them, as our modeling demonstrated, that numbers can possibly shift towards the negative if the Iran conflict with US and Israel continues and has a ripple effect, because then citizens might come and pose the question, your policies really didn't work as we thought they might. Okay, that no, because listen, the government is always held accountable. Right, citizens always hold government, the incumbent government, accountable. Okay, but there's the flip side of this. Okay, the flip side is conflict continues, but it's manageable. Armenia walks out of this intact, and the government is able to basically advance the argument that did you see how our planning and our strategic foreign policy, right, allowed Armenia to navigate out of this conundrum while a lot of our neighbors and the region suffered. In which case, that would actually blow up the government's numbers much higher, the incumbent party's numbers higher, when the citizen looks and says, wow, one of the biggest conflicts that the region has seen in a generation, Armenia walked out of this not only without losses, but in a really tenably a better position. So there are these developments, right, could affect the polls one way or another. But that is why we're going to be doing three more of this to have trend analysis and observations. But the Iran factor is something that we had not obviously considered as being an intervening variable or something that would affect the elections. Right now, we're still not seeing it affecting the elections because the war has not affected Armenia yet. But by April, right, by our third, fourth polling, we would have a much better idea.
It's fascinating how, in a matter of hours, things, people's perceptions and attitudes can shift when it's their physical security or their pocketbook, right, that's impacted by events that we have no control over in this case.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's why this when we speak like exogenous variables, right? To use sort of these academic terms, scholarly terms, it's a serious, serious factor. And citizens' sense of insecurity is a huge problem, and that's why this government's responsibility has been to make sure that Armenian society feels secure, and so far it has worked. And as you noted, right, I think in elections, once security is kind of established, citizens start taking it for granted. It's sort of like, well, this is how it's supposed to be. We're used to it, right? But one issue that nobody takes for granted is economics. And so in that context, right, pocketbook voting becomes the number one issue when security is no longer the most serious concern.
Right, and we've been pocketbook movement kind of a country for 20 years. It's just how it is, and but I mean, people
Absolutely.
just want to live a dignified life. At the end of the day, they want to feel safe, secure, have a job, take care of their family, and not worry about the enemy at the gate. But outside of our,
Absolutely.
as I said, in our first inaugural issue or episode of State of Play, we're going to be doing these each month. So I will be seeing you next month. So thank you.